Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. I will be talking to us about a few things that I think will be of helpful to you guys. And first of all, I want us to look at how do you prepare and review standard operating procedure. How do you prepare and review SOP? So before we continue, my name is Dr. Emmanuel Obodo. I'm a biomedical scientist and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science. So let's get into this. So there are two keywords there in terms of the question that we are asked. One, how do you review? And how do you prepare? Or how do you prepare and how do you review standard operating procedure? So there is something I want to debunk quickly before I continue. Most times when we hear standard operating procedure, what that comes to our mind is just step by step on how to do a certain type of job or task, as the case may be. So we talk about standard operating procedure. Most times we are looking at the procedures in terms of do this first, then you do this and do that. That is standard operating procedure. I want to really say that in itself doesn't have more percentage of what ideal SOP should look like. Let's start with your phone that you normally use, your phone or maybe your laptop or any gadget that you have. When you buy a phone, why it is important that they will tell you, okay, this is where you off it, this is how you on it, do this, that. They will tell you all of that. So that's the step-by-steps on how to operate that phone. But before they will even do that, most time they will start telling you about some things about the phone. Maybe they may tell you this phone, try to put it, not allow water to touch it, or maybe if water touches, nothing will happen to it. Sometimes they go as far as telling you how the phone function, the principle of the phone. They will explain the science or the technology behind the phone, its functionality. They will give you that. Before you will even start seeing things like, okay, these are the steps, okay? They can tell you the memory card, the memory capacity of the phone. They will tell you, maybe I don't know much about the pictures or images, but they will tell you, what the images will look like when you take the pictures or what it can do and all of that. They give you more information. So you will see when you open the manual of the phone, the step-by-steps on how to operate the phone has little more compared to other information that you receive. Similarly, when you also go into the lab and you talk about standard operating procedure, while it is important that we include step-by-steps on how to do something, it is more than that. Now, according to ISO 15189 and obviously UCAS as well and other regulatory bodies all over the world, you will notice that when you are preparing the SOP, it is recommended that you include a number of things, okay? Let's say it is a new SOP, because when you say prepare and review, so if you are reviewing SOP, that means we already had the SOP. But if you are preparing SOP, maybe it's a new SOP. So let us think it as though it's a new SOP. So when it comes to a new SOP, what it then means is that you've got to, first of all, define the scope of what that SOP should be covering. You should be able to define what is expected in that methodology, okay? Now, obviously, SOP also include that you have to, first of all, look at, the procedure perhaps that can take place before we can put that SOP in use, okay? So there are many things you consider, but let me try to streamline this into maybe what is expected when you go for interview. So when it comes to preparing SOP, first of all, you need to ask yourself, what do I want to achieve in this SOP? Let's take a test, okay? You've got to ask yourself, what test do I want to do? How do I want to do the test? How do I determine that the process or the method in place is working? Who can be trained to carry out that test? Are you getting me? How can the person be trained? Okay, how can we prepare the sample? Do you get? How is the sample going to be run and all of that? So these things has to take place before you even start thinking about the processes that are involved. Now let me make it more practical. So when you talk about, I want you to think about any test, any laboratory test. It doesn't matter now, okay? Think about any laboratory test. And if you're already working in NHS, go and check it. You will see that your standard operating procedure will not start with the step-by-steps. No, it wouldn't. So what it's going to do, you're going to see perhaps what the test is all about. Okay, let's say it's something like glucose test. Let's say glucose test. Of course, you know that there are different types of glucose, whether it's a fasting glucose, whether it's a 2 hours postprandial, whether it is OGTT, whatever thing it is. Okay, so these are different types. When we're preparing SOP for glucose, it is important that we include these types. But before then, whether it is 2 hours postprandial, whether it is OGTT, which is oral glucose tolerance test, whether it is fasting blood glucose, whether it is random glucose, it is glucose. Do you understand? So what we then need to do first is to talk about what this glucose means. What is a science? What is a principle of the glucose? Once you have talked about the principle of the glucose, the next thing we might need to now look at is what is the implication? Why do we need to do that glucose? Okay, these things are they're supposed to be part of the SOP. Why do you want to go ahead to step by step without even knowing what you are testing? Okay, now so you look at the principle, the implication, this needs to be included. You also include things like, is there risk factors that are associated in carrying out that test? For example, that test would perhaps involve maybe blood or urine, as the case might be. So what it then means is that these are biological, samples, and it means that they are biohazard. So there's a risk factors. So you have to consider the risk factors associated with carrying out that test. So I've mentioned the principle of that test, the implication of the test. Why are we doing the test? Why is the test important? Then we'll now talk about maybe things like the risk factors. Now, in that risk factor as well, we cannot include things like maybe like in terms of maybe how we can mitigate the risk. So maybe anybody carrying out this test, you try to wear hand glove, wear lab coat, and blah, blah, blah. So those things we're including, we have acknowledged the risk. We now say this is how we can mitigate the risk. We've not even started talking about the steps. Are you following, guys? So we've not already started. We're not talking about the steps. We are first of all trying to tell you more about that standard operating procedure. So now we've mentioned how to mitigate it. Now, after we talk about that, we can now mention things like, okay, in this test, these are the reference ranges. Okay, we can now look at, okay, if it is maybe, let's stick with glucose. If it is fasting glucose, this is a reference range. If it is random glucose, this is a reference range. OGTT, reference range. Random glucose, reference range, as the case may be. We'll put, that means SOP also include the reference ranges. Now, another thing you will see there that there may be some factors that can affect the SOP. That should also be included. We are not talking about how to do the test. That one most times is the end part of it. But unfortunately, if you don't know this, this is where most scientists start from. The step-by-step most times is the end part. Okay, so we now look at, what are the factors that can influence it? Okay, now those factors are what we are going to also highlight. Even when we have highlighted those factors, it is also important we mention the action plan or the action that can take to be able to correct those or make sure that those actions, the factors, that is affecting the test will not occur or will not, limit the possibility of getting accurate result. Okay, now so let's say something like glucose. Let's stick with glucose. Okay, you want to do fasting blood glucose test. One of the factors that can affect it could be if the patient comes without fasting. So that need to be included in that SOP and other tests, by the way. Okay, now one other thing that could affect it, like other tests as well, could be maybe the volume of the sample, perhaps hemolysis, or as the case may be, wrong sampling tube, or as the case may be. These things need to be included, and there has to be action plans on how to identify those things and what to do to ensure we make sure that we will detect that and not do the test. Because remember, Standard operating procedure means that by the end of that test, you are given a standard result. You are given a reliable result. You are given a reproducible result. So anything that can affect the reproducibility, the reliability of the result, that need to be, documented in the SOP, and there has to be a way to identify it, and there has to be a way to check it, and then there has to be a way to ensure that that will not happen where possible, by the way. Right. So we now look at the factor that can affect it. Now there are other things after we've done that. That's SOP. All this need to be documented. Now at the end, we now look at another thing we can look at is, okay, which equipment, that means equipment we can use to run the test, also need to be there. Then since equipment has come in, we can now look at how to maintain the equipment. Do you understand? How to do the maintain equipment, maybe equipment maintenance, calibration, QC, as the case may be, and all of that. That need to be also included in the SOP. Now, another thing we can include is that in the SOP, because of those factors that can affect the result, we can ask, okay, if you see this kind of result, this is what you should do. You see this result, this is what you should do. If you're already working in an NHS, you'll find that they tell you, okay, if the result is like this, maybe phone it or put it for bluffing or do this, as the case may be. That is part of the SOP. That need to be considered before that SOP can be in use. SOP is not just step by steps, okay, like how to do the test. There are more that is included. Now, another thing you are going to see in the SOP has to do with things like, okay, now we've mentioned the equipment. Who can train you in the equipment? Are you getting me? That means training is also important to be documented in the SOP. So when we are preparing SOP, another thing we consider is who and who can be trained. For example, first of all, who and who can do this test? Meaning, if you work in the lab, there are some tests that is only biomedical scientists that can do it. In fact, there are some tests that it is only specially biomedical scientists that can do it. You may be surprised that there are some certain activities in the lab that is a senior biomedical scientist that has to do it. Now, what that means is then that every standard operating procedure of any given task, there has to be who and who can do that test. Okay, now once you have determined who and who that can do the test, the reason why this is important is that so that you can know the scope of what you're supposed to practice is important, and this is consistent as well as recommended by HCPC, okay, even IBMS. Now, the point there is that there are some tests that maybe a medical laboratory assistant is also allowed to do, but maybe they cannot validate it, but at least they can do it. Do you understand the point, okay? Or BMS training can do it, but they cannot validate it. But there's some tests that they cannot even do at all. So these things, who can do the test has to be included. Who perhaps can validate the result has also been included in the SOP. Now, once you have determined who can do the test, who can validate it, another thing may be who then is qualified to do the training. So SOP should include who can do the training. Of course, once it includes who can do the training, it has indirectly shown who that cannot do the training. That's why there are some tests, it has to be some certain kind of band person that can do the training. So there are some tests, maybe a band 5 can train a band 4. There are some tests, it has to be a band 6. There are some tests, it has to be band 7. As the case may be, depending on the structure of that laboratory. But the point I want to make is that standard operating procedure has to include who and who that can do the test. Does that make sense? Okay, right. So now, once you have determined all of this, we can also talk about our maybe phone limit. Maybe when we see this limit of result, phone it. This is urgent, as the case may be. That also can also be included in the SOP. Before we can now talk about the step by step. Okay, maybe. In fact, there's something else I forgot. In the SOP, you also need to include how to prepare the sample preparation, and in that sample preparation it cannot include maybe the information that the patient needs to know before coming to phlebotomy for the sample to be collected. I hope that makes sense. Remember that here in the United Kingdom, and of course in other countries as well, you will see that we don't have access to patient most times. Okay, so the patient will go to the phlebotomy. It's important then that the lab tell the phlebotomy what is expected of the patient. So patient preparation is very, very important. Remember, if we get it wrong from the pre-analytical, it will affect both analytical and post-analytical. Okay, so anyway, so now after all of these things, then we can now talk about step by step. So now, if you go for interview, for example, I want to deviate a bit, and they ask you what is standard operating procedure, don't be just, it is naive in my own opinion to just talk about the step by steps. There are a number of things that can be included, as had already mentioned. Okay, so these are very, very important. Okay, so meaning that when we are preparing SOP, we consider all of these things that I've mentioned, whether it is the risk assessment, the risk associated with the test, whether it is the personnel that will run the test, whether it is PPE that need to be wear, the limit, all these things that I mentioned, that is the thing that you need to consider. Now, once you have done that, another thing that then we have the steps, and even without our steps, now I'm talking about preparing SOP, we then need to optimize the steps, because that steps need to be optimized to ensure that it can give us the result as expected. So we are going, even the equipment, of course, we also optimize it. We now need to make sure that we check, validate, or verify all the process. Maybe the reagent, we have to do reagent verification, we have to do of course the analyzer validation, we have to do the procedure, we have to optimize it. All this thing is to make sure that they are working. Once you are sure they are working, then you can document it. These are how you can prepare SOP. Now, SOP, of course, would also have to include who has written it, that is the author. It also has to include maybe who verified the SOP, as the case may be, or who approved the SOP. Does that make sense? SOP also include things like the version. For example, is it maybe 1.0 or 1.1? So it is important that you have the version of the SOP. This is because so that when we do a review, okay, then let's say we have SOP 1.0. When we do the review, we might have 1.1. Perhaps when we do another review, we can have 1.12, as the case may be. Does that make sense? Okay. So when it comes to SOP authors, the date, of course, the SOP were prepared, okay, and of course the year, obviously, and who approved it, and of course the version. These are important with evidence of signature as well. It is very, very important. I hope that makes sense. And that is why the SOP will also include, until this person is competent to do this, the person cannot carry out that test. So these are the information, and these are how you can prepare the SOP. So meaning that to prepare SOP, you must know what you want to achieve, the scope. You must talk about the test. You must talk about the science, the implication, and all of these things that I've mentioned. These things has to put into consideration in preparing the SOP. And can also add that in preparing SOP, no man is an island. So what you need to do then is to do consultation. So you can consult, maybe even if it's in other laboratory, do consultation. Do a wide consultation as you're preparing the SOP and all of that. And even within the laboratory, maybe during the optimization, you can ask people their opinion and all of that. This so scientific, understanding and interpretation is what that can help to produce effective standard operating procedure. Right. I hope you understood what I mean now in terms of preparing the SOP. Now, if you know how to prepare the SOP, to review it is very simple. So review then means that when we continue using that SOP, if we think that there are areas that can improve, we then review it, okay? Then if that area that can improve require that we optimize, then we can re-optimize. Let me give you a practical example. Let's say, for example, you are using SOP and this particular kit or particular reagent, whatever, as the case may be, okay? Now, you guys are using, but now you get another batch, or maybe decide to use another company, whatever thing that may have happened, and you are getting similar result, but it seems like the result can be better, then you can review it. The review is to find a better way we can still do the thing we are doing. Are you getting me? So let's say things like incubation. Maybe you normally incubate for 5 minutes. You can, maybe depending, you use different reagents, or new reagent, or new batch, whatever thing that may have happened, and you decided to review the SOP. And in that reviewing the SOP, you could change the incubation from 5 minutes to 6 minutes, or you could say from 5 to 6 minutes, as the case may be. That is how to review. So when we are reviewing SOP, we are reviewing SOP with a mind on how to improve that SOP. It doesn't mean that you have to change everything. The principle will still remain the same, and all those things you put will still, except if you want to change something. Maybe, for example, let's say you have somebody that can carry out this test is band 5, and you want to include band 4, then that's fair enough. You can put it, but most of the information will still be there. You only review that aspect you think that can be better, and that it can be any example. In fact, sometimes when UCAS comes to laboratory inspection, they can look at the SOP, and from what they saw from the SOP, they could give a recommendation of how that can change. And when they give that recommendation, when you change it, when you infect that change, then that is review, and of course the version will also change. And that is why when you are displaying it when you are showing UCAS the change you have made, you say this was the previous version, this is the current version. I think that makes sense. So that is how you prepare and review standard operating procedure. But please don't forget, SOP is way more than just the step-by-steps on how to do lab tests. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Please do let me know what you think about the video. Can I ask you to like, share, comment? Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best till I come back away again. Bye-bye.